Picture this. What if you woke up in 1740s London? But you're not waking up to some pleasant birds chirping morning sun. No, you're waking up in the late afternoon. You're rising from a cold, shared straw bed in a highly congested, drafty tenement in the East End, or maybe the notorious parish of St. Giles. You are likely an elderly man, an ex-soldier, or perhaps just an impoverished deputy hired for absolute pennies to take the place of a wealthier citizen who bought his way out of this mandatory civic duty. Your bones ache from the damp, coal-polluted metropolitan air, but you have to get up because your shift is about to begin.
So the grueling reality of your schedule starts right now. The night shift begins at 9 p.m. in the winter or 10 p.m. in the summer, and it lasts all the way until sunrise. You drag yourself out of your tenement and reluctantly trudge through the darkening streets to the parish watchhouse. This small timber or stone building is your base of operations. Inside, the ward beadle, he's the man in charge of the Watchman, barks out the roll call, writing your name down in the watchbook just to make sure you've actually shown up. Once you're accounted for, he issues you your equipment for the long 10-hour vigil ahead.
History often remembers these watchmen by the nickname Charlies, a term dating all the way back to Charles II. They were relentlessly mocked by the public as lazy, incompetent, elderly buffoons who just slept on the job. But look at the gear you're issued. You get a heavy parish greatcoat that basically acts like a sponge, becoming paralyzingly heavy the second it rains. Your only light source is a horn-pan lantern with a tallow candle that blows out in a stiff wind. For defense, you get a 6 to 8 foot stout wooden staff. It is incredibly cumbersome in a tight alley and easily wrestled away by a gang. And to call for help, you have a hand-spun wooden rattle. Sure, it makes a loud clattering sound, but the mechanism literally jams in freezing weather. Plus, in a riot, the sound is completely drowned out anyway. You aren't lazy. You were just fundamentally ill-equipped.
Now your place in the frankly bizarre social hierarchy of the 18th century knight, it is bleak. As a Charlie, you are despised, you're mocked, and you're paid a measly £13 a year by the parish rates. Compare that to the nightmen or gong farmers. These were the men whose actual job was to dig up and cart away human excrement from the city's cesspits between midnight and 5 a.m. Because the nightmen were independent, enterprising, and obviously highly necessary in a city with no real sewage system, they earned 2 to 3 times your salary. The guys shoveling human waste were richer, they were more respected, and they were considered far more efficient than you, the very face of law and order. Okay, you leave the watchhouse in pairs to begin your patrol. When you aren't walking, you might try to seek some shelter in your assigned sentry box. But even resting is a massive hazard. A super popular sport among wealthy, intoxicated young men was something called doing a mohawk. They would creep up behind your sentry box and violently tip the whole hut forward, trapping you helplessly inside. But rowdy aristocrats are honestly the least of your problems. The real monster roaming the streets is gin. Look at this staggering number. By 1743, the English were consuming 2.2 gallons, that is 10 liters of gin per person per year. This so-called gin craze was the direct result of economic protectionism. The government restricted French brandy imports and actively encouraged domestic grain distillation. Food prices dropped, incomes grew slightly, and suddenly the urban poor had excess funds to spend on unregulated, untaxed domestic spirits.
You have to understand, the working class of the era lived in deep, crushing poverty. Wages were intentionally kept low to keep English manufacturing competitive. For these people, gin was a cheap escape from the cold, the hunger, and the squalor. A very famous sign of the era actually read, "Drink for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, clean straw for nothing." But this wasn't your modern artisanal gin. Backstreet compounders laced this stuff with turpentine and sulfuric acid, literally drain cleaner, just to flavor it. And the demographic cost of all this was devastating. By 1723, the death rate in London massively outstripped the birth rate. At the absolute height of the craze, an unbelievable 75% of babies were dying before they reached the age of 5. This is the massive public health catastrophe you are trying to police.
Your specific patrol route literally dictates your chances of survival here. Look at this geographic divide in 1743. If you were lucky enough to patrol the wealthy St. George's Hanover Square, the ratio of gin shops to houses was 1 to 50. Your biggest threats were, carriage accidents or petty theft. But if you were assigned to St. Giles in the Fields or Holborn, the ratio was 1 to 5. 1 in every 5 houses was a gin shop. You are walking into an area with 820 active gin retailers packed into just a few square miles.
The entire pace of the city changes here. This isn't just a neighborhood, it is an impenetrable fortress of poverty.
The Rookery is a dense, high-crime slum designed as a blind honeycomb of narrow, crooked, unpaved alleys and cul-de-sacs. It was architecturally adapted by counterfeiters and fugitives specifically to keep lawmen like you hopelessly lost. Entering St. Giles is a total sensory nightmare. Step off the paved streets of Bloomsbury and your boots immediately sink into deep mud mixed with rotting cabbage stalks and animal offal. The air is thick, suffocating you with a noxious blend of burning coal soot and overflowing cesspits, cut right through by the sharp chemical aroma of turpentine from the illicit distilleries. The buildings are decaying, windows stuffed with rags. And all around you, pouring out of pitch-black cellars, you hear the chaotic soundtrack of the night: violent arguments, slurred drunken singing, and sudden, terrifying screams.
Listen to the voices of the people who are actually trapped in this environment. Now, though this specific complaint to the Times was published a century later in 1849, it perfectly captures the unbroken, generational squalor of St. Giles. The resident writes, "We live in muck and filth. We ain't got no privies, no dustbins, no drains, no water supplies, and no drain or sewer in the whole place." This is the utter desperation that fueled the violence and the drinking. It was an environment of total, inescapable, systemic neglect.
So within this terrifying maze, what is your actual job? Well, you aren't exactly a detective solving murders. Your primary role is imposing a strict moral and social curfew. You're tasked with checking the doors are locked, watching out for fires, and challenging absolutely anyone who seems suspicious. This legal authority comes from the Nightwalker Statutes, which originated all the way back to the 1285 Statute of Winchester. These laws gave you sweeping and frankly arbitrary powers of arrest. Anyone found outside during the hours of darkness without a valid reason could be deemed a suspect. You had the power to detain vagrants, sex workers, and the destitute on suspicion alone, literally dragging them back through the dark streets to lock them in the watchhouse cage for the night.
But executing those sweeping powers meant navigating a very dense minefield of prejudice. By the late 18th century, St. Giles was home to 20% of London's Irish poor. Because of contemporary English discourses, fears of violence, and events like the 1798 rebellion, the Irish were heavily targeted by watchmen like you. They were massively overrepresented among the arrested. But historical data from the Old Bailey actually reveals a much more complex reality. While they were heavily punished for violent offenses, in the vast majority of cases, which were property crimes, the Irish were actually no more likely to be convicted than other groups, and their sentences were sometimes even slightly less severe. Yet, as a watchman right there on the ground, you were the blunt instrument of a prejudiced system, regularly sweeping the streets based heavily on suspicion and ethnic bias. Finally, the darkness begins to lift. The manic pacing of the city starts to slow. It's 5 a.m. in the summer, or perhaps 7 a.m. in the freezing winter. The sun begins to rise, filtering dimly through the thick canopy of coal soot hanging over the metropolis. Your joints are stiff, your greatcoat is soaked through, and your lantern has long since burned out. You have survived the night. But your shift isn't quite over. Now begins the mechanical, bureaucratic churn of daylight justice. You return to the watchhouse. The ward beadle takes the book and logs the night's events. If you've actually managed to drag anyone in under those Nightwalker statutes, you must hand over custody of those prisoners from the holding cage directly to the parish constable. You present your evidence, and then the constable escorts the exhausted prisoners to the local magistrate's office to face a formal trial. Only then are you finally, officially relieved of duty. You hand in your staff, you hand in your rattle, you walk back to your shared straw bed in the daylight, knowing that in just a few short hours, the sun will set and you're going to have to do it all over again. Now, the gin craze did eventually fade by 1757, mainly due to crop failures and much stricter licensing, but the brutal reality of urban policing remained. So looking at the miserable pay, the overwhelming odds, the deadly environment, and the deeply flawed justice system, I want to leave you with this one question. How many nights could you survive keeping the peace in a gin-crazed metropolis?